The headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting today from Boston. It's Patriots' Day here in Massachusetts, a state holiday to mark the start of the Revolutionary War. In a Democracy Now! Special, we're joined today by two of the city's leading dissidents, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. Noam Chomsky began teaching linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge over 50 years ago. He's the author of scores of books on linguistics and on U.S. foreign policy. His most recent book is called Failed States: The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. Howard Zinn is one of the country's most widely read historians. He taught political science at Boston University from 1964 to 1988. His classic work, A People's History of the United States, has sold over 1.5 million copies. It's altered how many teach the nation's history. Howard Zinn's latest book is called A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. Today, an hour with Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky in a rare interview with them together. And I welcome you both to Democracy Now!
Pleased to be with you.
What a day to be here. This is the day of the Boston Marathon. It is raining. It is a major storm outside, and tens of thousands of people. Well, were either of you planning to run today?
We were, yes, but yeah, we were ready.
You made it impossible for us.
I'm sorry.
It was a choice of running in the marathon or having an interview with you. What's more important?
Well, today is Patriots' Day, Howard Zinn. What does patriotism mean to you?
I'm glad you said what it means to me, because it means to me something different than it means to a lot of people, I think, who have distorted the idea of patriotism. Patriotism, to me, means doing what you think your country should be doing. Patriotism means supporting your government when you think it's doing right, opposing your government when you think it's doing wrong. Patriotism, to me, means really what the Declaration of Independence suggests, and that is that government is an artificial entity. Government is set up, and this is what the Declaration of Independence is about, government is set up by the people in order to fulfill certain responsibilities, equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And when, according to the Declaration of Independence, the government violates those responsibilities, then, and these are the words of the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. In other words, the government is not holy. The government is not to be obeyed when the government is wrong. And so to me, patriotism, in its best sense, means thinking about the people in the country, the principles for which the country stands for, and it requires opposing the government when the government violates those principles. So today, for instance, the highest act of patriotism, I suggest, would be opposing the war in Iraq and calling for a withdrawal of troops from Iraq, simply because everything about the war violates the fundamental principles of equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, not just for Americans, but for people in another part of the world. So, yes, patriotism today requires citizens to be active on many, many different fronts to oppose government policies on war, government policies which have taken trillions of dollars from this country's treasury and used it for war and militarism. That's what patriotism would require today.
Noam Chomsky, the headlines today, just this weekend, one of the bloodiest in months in Iraq. The number of prisoners in U.S. jails in Iraq has reached something like 18,000. Who knows if that's not an underestimate. An Associated Press photographer remains in jail, imprisoned by U.S. authorities without charge for more than a year. The health ministry has found 70% of Baghdad's school children showing symptoms of trauma-related stress. your assessment now of the situation there?
This is one of the worst catastrophes in military history and also in political history. The most recent studies of the Red Cross show that Iraq has suffered the worst decline in child mortality, infant mortality, increase in infant mortality known. But it's since 1990. That is, it's a combination of the effect of the murderous and brutal sanctions regime, which we don't talk much about, which devastated the society through the 1990s, strengthened Saddam Hussein, compelled the population to rely on him for survival. It probably saved him from the fate of a whole long series of other tyrants who were overthrown by their own people, supported by the U.S. And then came the war on top of it, which has simply increased the horrors. The decline is unprecedented. The increase in infant mortality under 5, unprecedented. It's now below the level of countries in worse than the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. That's one index of what's happened. The most probable measure of deaths in a study sponsored by MIT, incidentally carried out by leading specialists in Iraq and here. Last October was about 650,000 killed. Soon it'll push 1 million. There are several million people have fled, including the large part of the professional classes, people who could, in principle, help rebuild the country. And without going on, it's a hideous catastrophe and getting worse. It's also worth stressing that aggressors do not have any rights. This is a clear-cut case of aggression and violation of the UN Charter, the supreme international crime, in the words of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Aggressors simply have no rights to make any decisions. They have responsibilities. The responsibilities are, first of all, to pay enormous reparations, and that includes, for the effect of the sanctions, in fact, it ought to include the support for Saddam Hussein during the 1980s, which was torture for Iraqis and worse for Iranians. Pay reparations, hold those responsible accountable, and attend to the will of the victims. It doesn't necessarily mean follow it blindly, but certainly attend to it. And the will of the victims is known. There are regular U.S.-run polls in Iraq, the government and polling institutions. There's just an overwhelming support for either immediate or quick withdrawal of U.S. troops. About 80% think that the presence of U.S. troops increases the level of violence. Over 60% think that troops are legitimate targets. This, incidentally, is all of Iraq. If you take the figures for Arab Iraq, where the troops are actually deployed, it's considerably higher, and these figures keep going up. They are unmentioned, virtually unreported, scarcely alluded to in the Baker-Hamilton critical report. That'll be our prime concern, along with the concerns of Americans.
Vice President Cheney saying this war can be won.
Yeah, which is an interesting study being done right now by a former Russian soldier in Afghanistan in the late 1980s. He's now a student in Toronto, who's comparing the Russian press and Russian political figures and military leaders, what they were saying about Afghanistan, comparing it with what Cheney, others, and the press are saying about Iraq. And not to your great surprise, change a few names and it comes out about the same. Yeah, they were also saying the war in Afghanistan could be won, and they were right. If they had increased the level of violence sufficiently, they could have won the war in Afghanistan.